Did Paul reject the ongoing relevance of the Sabbath and festivals commanded in the Torah? Many people point to Colossians 2 verses 16 through 17 as proof that he did. However, a growing number of scholars call that interpretation into question. Scholars argue that the Colossian believers actually observed the biblical calendar and that they were being criticized by ascetic opponents who did not. In this video, I'm going to draw on that scholarship to show why I believe that Colossians 2 verses 16 through 17 does not invalidate the Sabbath and festivals, but instead affirms their value. Introduction. Let's look at what Paul says in Colossians 2 verses 16 through 17. He tells his readers not to let anyone judge them, quote, with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. Then he explains that these practices, quote, are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Unlike Galatians 4 verse 10 and Romans 14 verse 5, which I would argue are not addressing the biblical calendar at all, this passage unambiguously refers to the Sabbath and festivals prescribed in the law of Moses. Many interpreters claim that here, Paul is responding to Jewish legalists who were insisting that followers of Jesus must keep the Sabbath and festivals. As a result, many conclude that Paul considered these practices to be a matter of indifference. A good example of this popular perspective comes from John MacArthur. He writes, quote, "The false teachers were telling the Colossians that it was not enough to have Christ. They also needed to keep the Jewish ceremonial law, including, quote, festivals and Sabbath day worship." MacArthur goes on to argue that, quote, "Jesus is the reality to which the shadows pointed, and therefore, quote, any continuing preoccupation with the shadows once the reality has come is pointless." In other words, according to MacArthur, Paul is assuring his readers that they do not need to accept criticism from people trying to impose Sabbath and festival observance upon them, because Christ's coming has rendered those practices irrelevant. However, although this interpretation of Colossians 2 verses 16 through 17 is common, a growing number of scholars have challenged it. Scholars like Brian Allen, Harold Weiss, Troy Martin, and others argue that Paul is actually making the opposite point. According to this view, the Colossian believers were not being criticized for disregarding the biblical calendar, they were being criticized for observing it. These scholars identify Paul's opponents in Colossians as strict ascetics, the very kind of people described later in the chapter who promote harsh self-denial and man-made rules. From this perspective, the ascetics condemned the Colossian believers' festive eating and drinking during the Sabbath, festivals, and new moon, celebrations that Paul describes as, quote, a shadow of things to come. On this reading, the things to come refers to the eschatological age to come, when Isaiah says that everyone will worship the Lord from Sabbath to Sabbath and from new moon to new moon. Isaiah also pictures that future kingdom as a lavish feast where God's people enjoy rich food and well-aged wine. The celebratory joy experienced during the Sabbath festivals and new moons foreshadows this coming joy. So instead of telling the Colossians to abandon these observances, Paul is encouraging them not to be intimidated by ascetic critics who condemned them for celebrating them. So which interpretation is right? Well, the truth is, if you read Colossians 2 verses 16 through 17 by itself, either view is possible. Paul's readers could have been criticized for neglecting the Sabbath and festivals, or they could have been criticized for observing them. The verses alone don't settle the question. Therefore, in order to determine which interpretation makes the most sense, we have to look at the broader context. First, is there evidence that the believers in Colossae were actually keeping the Sabbath and the biblical festivals? Second, what about Paul's opponents? Were they observing these practices, or were they rejecting them? If Paul's readers were not keeping the biblical calendar and their opponents were, then the popular interpretation fits. In that case, Paul's opponents would have been judging the Colossians for failing to observe the Sabbath and festivals. But if the opposite is true, if the Colossian believers were observing the biblical calendar while their opponents were not, then the alternative interpretation makes much better sense. In that case, Paul would be telling the Colossians not to let those critics judge them for observing the biblical calendar. So let's consider the first question. Is there evidence that the believers in Colossae were actually keeping the Sabbath and festivals? Many interpreters assume that neither Paul nor his mostly Gentile audience at Colossae were observing the biblical calendar when Colossians was written. But this assumption should be called into question. Remember, the apostles operated within first century Judaism, which observed the biblical calendar. The New Testament also shows that Jewish followers of Jesus retained this calendar in their own worship and communal life. When Gentiles began following Jesus, they were not joining some new non-Jewish religion. They were joining a Messianic Jewish community. Hence, we should expect those Gentile believers to have embraced the same biblical calendar that their Jewish fellow believers were already observing. The book of Acts gives us important evidence on this point. According to Luke, Paul did not reject the biblical calendar after becoming a follower of Jesus. The biblical calendar is part of God's law, and throughout Acts, Luke goes to great lengths to depict Paul as living, quote, in observance of the law. As Joshua Jipp writes, quote, Luke's view of Paul is that he is a faithful, Torah-observant Jew, faithful to his ancestral heritage in every way. We see this in Paul's regular participation in synagogue services on the Sabbath, where he ministered to both Jews and Gentiles. We also see it in the way that Paul continued to observe the annual biblical festivals, such as Pentecost and the Day of Atonement. As Justin Hardin observes, these references indicate that Paul, quote, was not at all critical of the Jewish calendar, but even continues to orient his life around it. Acts also gives us insight into what was expected of Gentile believers. In Acts 15, verse 21, James indicates that Gentile followers of Jesus would hear the law of Moses read in the synagogues every Sabbath. Since many Gentile believers were already attending synagogue services on the Sabbath, the expectation seems to be that they would continue doing so. As Benjamin Frostad writes, quote, James' proposal assumes that Gentile believers will have an ongoing relationship with the believing Jewish community, that their lives will be structured around the biblical calendar, and that they will grow in their knowledge and observance of Scripture. More evidence of early Christian observance of the biblical calendar appears in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. Near the end of the letter, Paul says, quote, I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. That simple comment tells us something important. Paul expected his readers to know exactly when Pentecost was. Furthermore, as David Rudolph notes, quote, since Pentecost is calculated by counting 50 days after the day after the Sabbath during Passover week, Paul implies that the literal day of Passover was not insignificant to the community. Even more significant is what Paul says earlier in the letter. Speaking to a congregation made up of both Jews and Gentiles, he writes, quote, let us therefore celebrate the festival. Paul's use of the term festival indicates that he is referring to celebrating the actual festival of Passover. As J. Brian Tucker writes, quote, the fact that he explicitly mentions a festival suggests that he expects the Corinthian Christ group to engage in a real Passover celebration, even if it is now imbued with new meaning considering Christ's sacrifice. There's one more piece of historical evidence that's worth considering. In the late 2nd century, the churches of Asia Minor, the same region where Colossae was located, became involved in what's known as the Quarter-Deciman controversy. The issue was when Christians should celebrate Passover. A large number of churches in Asia Minor continued to observe it on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, following the biblical calendar. One of the key figures in that debate was Polycrates, the bishop of Ephesus. He said this wasn't a new practice. It had been handed down from earlier leaders like John, Philip, and Polycarp. As he put it, quote, "We observe the exact day, neither adding nor taking away." So, long after Paul wrote to the Colossians, many Christian communities in Asia Minor were still observing Passover according to the biblical calendar. If believers in that region had already abandoned the biblical calendar in the first century, it is difficult to explain why this practice remained so widespread. There's much more that could be said about this topic, but even this brief survey is enough to challenge the common assumption that the early believers were not observing the Sabbath and festivals at the time Paul wrote his letter. As Brian Allen writes, quote, "Considering the New Testament evidence, it is plausible that Paul continued in these practices and encouraged other communities of Jews and Gentiles to do the same." So far, we looked at the evidence that Paul and the Colossian believers were observing the biblical calendar. Now we need to ask, what about Paul's opponents? Were they keeping the Sabbath, festivals, and new moons? That question is important because it helps us identify who the practices in Colossians 2:16 actually belong to. If the evidence shows that Paul's opponents were not observing the biblical calendar while his readers were, then Colossians 2:16 is best understood as Paul telling his readers not to let those critics judge them for observing the Sabbath, the festivals, and the new moons. So, to answer this question, let's look at how Paul describes the Colossian opponents elsewhere in the letter. This will shed light on whether these opponents were the kind of people who would have observed the biblical calendar. The first clue is that Paul says his opponents were, quote, "insisting on asceticism." That's an important detail because, as Harold Weiss points out, quote, "ascetic practices are not characteristic of the Torah or of mainstream Judaism." In fact, with one major exception, that is, the fast on the Day of Atonement, the biblical Sabbath, festivals, and new moons were not associated with fasting or self-denial at all. Quite the opposite. They were occasions for celebration, fellowship, and joyful feasting. We even see this reflected in ancient Jewish sources. For example, the Book of Judith depicts Judith as refraining from fasting on, quote, "the day before the Sabbath and the Sabbath itself, the day before the new moon, the day of the new moon, and the feasts and celebration days of the house of Israel." That makes Paul's description of the Colossian opponents especially significant. If these people were insisting on asceticism, they don't sound like the kind of people who would encourage celebration of the biblical calendar. The second clue is just as important. Paul says that his opponents' teachings were, quote, "according to human tradition." He even summarizes their rules: do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And notice how Paul describes those rules. He doesn't present them as instructions from the Torah. He calls them human precepts and teachings. So, if these regulations come from human tradition, then they're not rooted in the law that God gave through Moses. And that creates a problem for the common interpretation of this passage. If Paul's opponents were promoting man-made rules instead of the Torah, it is difficult to see how they could be seeking to impose the Torah's Sabbath and festivals. So these two observations point in the same direction. Based on Paul's description, the Colossian opponents do not appear to be the kind of people who would have been observing the biblical calendar. And there's another piece of evidence that strengthens this conclusion. Some scholars, especially Troy Martin, have argued that the teachings Paul describes bear a striking resemblance to those of the ancient Cynics, who were staunchly opposed to wine and festive meals. One Cynic philosopher named Crates wrote, quote, "Accustom yourselves to eat barley cake and to drink water, and do not taste fish and wine. For the latter, like the drugs of Circe, make old men bestial and young men effeminate." What's interesting is that Crates' language resembles the prohibitions we find in Colossians. Moreover, as Martin observes, the Cynics also condemned the use of calendars. Quote, "Cynic sources contain few references to time because the Cynics disregard time beyond the hours of the day, and these hours are only of relative usefulness. Instead of organizing their lives according to a system of time, they prefer to live day by day. Contentment and happiness for the Cynic means ignoring temporal constraints. The anti-cultural cynic movement disparages the cultural phenomenon of time. This cynic attitude toward time promotes a pungent critique of the Christian regulation of communal life by a religious calendar. The cynic considers this practice a useless waste of effort that detracts from the true pursuit of morality and happiness. In addition to opposing festive meals, wine, and calendars, the Cynics also rejected physical comforts and promoted rigorous self-denial. That lines up well with Paul's description of the Colossian opponents as advocating what he calls severity to the body. Given these features of Cynic philosophy, it is evident that its adherents would be highly critical of the Sabbath festivals and new moons, which are celebrations marked by a calendar and which often involved wine, festive meals, and rejoicing. In any case, whatever we conclude about the precise identity of Paul's opponents, one point remains clear. Paul says their teachings come not from the Torah, but from human precepts and human tradition. Thus, in context, it's difficult to read Colossians 2:16 as though Paul were warning against people trying to impose the Torah's calendar. A better reading is that the Colossian believers themselves were observing the Sabbath, the festivals, and the new moons. Paul's concern is that they were being criticized for doing so. In other words, Paul is not telling the Colossians to stop observing the biblical calendar. He is telling them not to let ascetic critics judge them for faithfully observing it. As Troy Martin puts it, quote, "The Colossian Christians, not their critics, participate in a religious calendar that includes festivals, new moons, and Sabbaths." With that foundation in place, we're finally ready to take a fresh look at Paul's exhortation in Colossians 2 verses 16 through 17. If the Colossian believers were the ones observing the biblical calendar, while their critics were not, then Paul's words take on a very different meaning. Instead of dismissing the Sabbath, the festivals, and the new moons, Paul is defending those believers who were faithfully observing them. Let's take a look at the passage itself in light of that context. "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." The first thing to notice is that Paul tells the Colossians not to let anyone judge them with respect to, quote, food and drink. Some interpreters assume this is a reference to the Torah's dietary laws. On that reading, the opponents were criticizing the Colossians because they were not following the dietary laws. However, as we've already seen, Paul describes his opponents' teachings as human traditions, not teachings that come from the Torah. So if their rules are not based on the Torah, why would we assume that they were trying to impose the Torah's food laws? There's another important detail here as well. Paul doesn't just mention food, he mentions food and drink. Outside of a few very specific situations, like the Nazirite vow or priests serving in the tabernacle, the Torah does not regulate the drinking of wine. So what is Paul referring to when he mentions food and drink? Well, a better explanation is that he is talking about the act of eating and drinking itself. That fits the immediate context. Paul mentions food and drink and then immediately refers to the Sabbath, the festivals, and the new moons. Those ideas naturally belong together because the biblical calendar was celebrated with joyful feasting and drinking. So, on this reading, Paul is talking about the fact that the Colossians were eating and drinking as part of their observance of the biblical calendar. As Allen remarks, quote, "Food and drink in verse 16 do not refer to the Levitical dietary instructions. Rather, their mention is actually a clue that ascetics were criticizing the Colossians for their lavish feasts during Sabbaths, festivals, and new moons, times that were not normally associated with fasting and affliction." Paul then expands his instruction. He tells the Colossians not to let anyone judge them with regard to, quote, a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. There's really no ambiguity about what those terms refer to. They're a standard way of describing the biblical calendar. The real question is why the Colossians were being judged. Were they being criticized for failing to observe the biblical calendar, or were they being criticized for observing it? Based on the evidence we've covered, the second option makes much better sense. we've seen that the earliest followers of Jesus, both Jewish and Gentile, continued to observe the biblical calendar. We've also seen that Paul's opponents are described as ascetics whose teachings come from human tradition, not from the Torah. In light of those facts, it seems that the Colossian believers were celebrating the Sabbath, the festivals, and the new moons, and their ascetic critics were condemning them for doing so. Paul's response is simple: don't let them judge you. As Allen writes, quote, numerous texts portray the early believers in the Messiah, both Jew and Gentile, involved in the Jewish calendar. Paul wrote to encourage the Colossians that no one should condemn them for eating and drinking, especially on Sabbaths and festivals. Now we come to verse 17, where Paul explains why these practices matter. He writes, quote, these are a shadow of the things to come. Notice that Paul uses the present tense verb are. He does not say that these practices were a shadow of things to come. He says they are a shadow of things to come. That means that from the perspective of Paul and the Colossian believers, the Sabbath, the festivals, and the new moons are currently serving as shadows that point forward to future realities. Some English translations can make it sound as though Paul is referring to things that used to point forward before Christ came, but the Greek does not permit such a reading. Now, some people compare this verse with Hebrews 10 verse 1, which also speaks about a shadow of the good things to come to describe the Torah's sacrificial system as pointing toward what the Messiah had already accomplished. But this parallel does not undermine the present tense force of Colossians 2:17. As Martin observes, in Hebrews 10 verse 1, quote, the futurality of the good things to come is from the perspective of the Mosaic law rather than from the perspective of the recipients of this letter. A future event relative to the law, but a past event relative to the present situation of the addressees. By contrast, in Colossians, Paul is talking about practices the believers are currently observing while defending them against present-day critics, and he says those practices are a shadow of things to come. That means the realities Paul has in mind are still future from the perspective of both Paul and the Colossians. This raises the question of what exactly Paul means by things to come. Well, in the context of Colossians, it appears to point to the believers' future hopes, such as the Messiah's return, the resurrection, and related eschatological expectations. As Weiss observes, quote, the other teachers promise access to ultimate reality by means of asceticism, worship with angels, and visions. In this connection, they impose regulations as to what can be handled. In opposition, the author of Colossians insists that ultimate reality is in the future, when the things to come come. In this case, the shadow is the present blurred manifestation of a hoped-for future reality. In its shadow, the expected future is seen as coming. The eschatological future loomed large on the horizon of the author of Colossians. He defines the mystery in which the Colossians now have a share as Christ in you, the hope of glory. He is concerned that they may abandon the hope rather than the faith. In the introductory thanksgiving, he praises God because of the hope laid up for you in heaven. In view of what the future holds for them, he instructs his readers to make the most of the time, since the parousia is not far away. When the expected parousia takes place and Christ appears, the author reminds them that they will appear in glory as well. Rather than to find present worship with angels and visions appealing, the author has his hopes firmly tied to the glorious future coming of Christ. In Isaiah's vision of the Messianic kingdom, all people will worship the Lord from new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath. This depiction of the coming age associates the Sabbath and new moons with eschatological hope and expectation. As Weiss remarks, the Sabbath festivals and new moons, quote, are anticipations of the eschatological realities in which Christians have their hope. The celebratory joy experienced while observing these appointed times represents, quote, the present blurred manifestation of a hoped-for future reality. Hence, describing the Colossian believers' practices as being a shadow of things to come, quote, is clearly a way of giving them value. So what are these shadows pointing toward? In Colossians, Paul's ultimate hope is the future return of the Messiah. Later in the letter, he tells his readers that when Christ appears, they will also appear with him in glory. Until that day comes, Paul tells the Colossians not to let anyone condemn them for observing the Sabbath, the festivals, and the new moons. Why? Because these practices continue to point forward to that future glory. But Paul immediately adds an important qualification. He says the substance belongs to Christ. In other words, the Sabbath and biblical festivals are not ends in themselves. They point to the Messiah. They give us a glimpse of the coming kingdom, but the Messiah himself embodies the reality they foreshadow. The joy, rest, and celebration experienced through these appointed times are rooted in the Messiah, who has already inaugurated the age to come, even though its full fulfillment still lies ahead. Because believers are united with Messiah, they already experience a foretaste of that coming age. As they celebrate the Sabbath and the biblical festivals, they look forward with hope to the day when the things to come come. So the shadows are meaningful precisely because they're connected to the Messiah. Far from becoming pointless, to use MacArthur's word, the fact that these practices point to the realities embodied in the Messiah actually imbues the Colossian believers' celebrations with even greater significance. In conclusion, this study has argued that Colossians 2 verses 16 through 17 does not abolish the Sabbath and biblical festivals, but instead responds to criticism directed at believers who continued to observe them. The evidence suggests that Paul and the Colossian community lived according to the biblical calendar, whereas their opponents promoted ascetic practices rooted in human tradition rather than the Torah. In this context, Paul urges his readers not to accept criticism from those who opposed their festive eating and drinking on festivals, new moons, and the Sabbath. By describing these practices as a shadow of things to come, Paul emphasizes how they point forward to future realities associated with the Messiah's return and the consummation of the kingdom, realities that are embodied in the Messiah himself. Read this way, Colossians 2 verses 16 through 17 does not invalidate the Sabbath and festivals, but rather affirms their ongoing value. I hope this video was a blessing for you guys. Thank you for watching.